Shana Tova. A number of weeks ago in the Thursday morning discussion class that I teach, we talked a little bit about Louis IX. For those who weren't there, let me fill you in. Who was Louis IX? You might guess that he was a king. Indeed, you might guess he was a French king, and you would be right. But his resume also included leading 2 crusades, the largest Talmud burning in history, expelling the Jews from his lands, and generally encouraging the killing of Jews. Probably he doesn't seem like such a great guy to you, and I think it's fair to say that he was quite anti-Semitic. Now, you might think that history would not look kindly upon such a person, but in fact, the Catholic Church canonized him not long after his death. He is, in fact, the St. Louis, which the Missouri city is named for. Now, in that city, there's a statue of Louis on a horse, which is, I am told, one of the city's best-known monuments, over 100 years old. Now, I don't have to tell you that there is a lot of controversy in our times about taking down statues of historical figures, whether they are being taken down by government process or by protesters acting on their own, which are, let me point out, 2 very different things. Now, we are reassessing historical figures who supported slavery or who were known racists or Confederates, even Jewish Confederates. But what about known anti-Semites? Especially ones like Louis IX, who was responsible for the mass destruction of holy texts, not to mention many Jewish deaths. The Catholic Church, of course, is opposed to the removal of the statue, given that they consider him a saint for his charitable acts and his judicial reforms, and that we should understand that in his time, he believed what was current Christian thought, that he was doing a good thing by trying to help the Jews by encouraging them to become Christian for their own good. It is, according to them, only in our historical view that his actions appear to be problematic. They say that his piety and his reverence is a model and inspiration for the denizens of modern St. Louis. There's an effort underway to petition the city to remove this monument, but it's not clear how successful such an effort will actually be. Nevertheless, it may be that thinking about this situation from an anti-Semitism perspective, as well as the rather dismissive and ignorant responses from some of the parties, does help us shed some light on how blacks and other groups feel about the statues that they themselves find offensive, and the rationalizations that are sometimes made about understanding historical figures as a product of the time that they lived in. Unfortunately, in the times that we live in, pretty much anything happening in the public domain becomes politicized. But as a rabbi, I try not to take a side based on a political view, but to ask myself, what does Judaism and Jewish values teach about the situation? And form an opinion informed by that. So that is the question I began asking myself about this wave of efforts to remove these kinds of statues from public spaces. The first and foremost thought in my mind was that Judaism is not very big on statues. Even in our age, where the vast majority of people on the planet practice monotheism, we still tend to make associations between statues and idolatry, and that actually seems particularly appropriate here, given that the word idol also has a meaning of role model, someone we look up to greatly, or at least that someone does, or probably there wouldn't be a monument to them in the first place. The Bible warns us about becoming like Pharaoh, who believed himself a god, that we must not elevate humans to that kind of status either. Even to this day, one typically would remove statues from the eastern wall in a shiva house so that the prayer services are not done facing them, which has the look of idol worship, even if we all know it's not. Those of you who joined us on Zoom may have noticed that something similar was in the best practices for creating a prayer space in your homes. You are probably familiar with the famous midrash, not actually a story in the Torah, about Abraham's father owning an idol shop and Abraham smashing all the idols in it, and that definitely comes to my mind. But that is hardly the be-all and end-all of what Judaism has to say about this matter. For one thing, any damage one does to another person's property or public property, which is done intentionally, would require paying full damages for repair or replacement. No one, not even a large group of people, is permitted to destroy another person's property simply because they don't like it. That would seem to rule out protesters bringing an offensive statue down on their own. But you might say that in the Midrash, Abraham destroyed the idols without repercussion because they were morally wrong. The Israelites, upon entering Canaan, were commanded to destroy all idols and idol worship paraphernalia, making the destruction of morally offensive statues not only acceptable, but desirable. But in those examples, we are dealing with idol worship, which is one of the big three greatest sins in Judaism, for which all temptation and implied suggestion is to be removed. As much as some may think that these statues are important historical figures, ones deserving admiration or even saints, no one is actually worshiping these statues, so the comparison does not hold up very well. Not to mention that in the case of entering Canaan, the order to destroy was issued from God, through Moses, and later Joshua. So it came from the legitimate governing body, such as it was in that time. So that brings us to the question of whether Jewishly we should be seeking out the removal of statues of people who held views offensive to some through persuading the government or private owners of the statues to remove them. One problem with this is determining what level of offense and to what person or group would prompt us to remove a statue. Opposite that question is, what level of contribution to society or good character, if any, would mitigate the removal of the statue because the good outweighs the bad? If we should only have monuments for people who held no views offensive to anyone in the present day, I suspect we wouldn't have a lot of monuments left. And maybe, from a Jewish perspective, we would be okay with that, but it doesn't seem particularly realistic. Let's look at some of our own major historical figures. We talked about Abraham as the father of monotheism, but when he visits foreign cities, he twice tries to pass off Sarah as his sister rather than his wife to avoid potential danger to himself, but putting Sarah into a terrible situation as she is forced into the king's harem. And the Torah tells us he gets very rich in the process too. Even the rabbis of the Talmudic era find this highly problematic, let alone under today's standards. As for agreeing to sacrifice Isaac without argument, well, we'll leave that one for tomorrow. But even in today's Torah reading, we can see things to be concerned about. Common wisdom is that this Torah reading is about the birth of Isaac. But the actual fact is that more of the portion is taken up by the story of the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. This is, in fact, the second time that Hagar has departed from Abraham and Sarah's household. When Hagar was pregnant with Ishmael, an event initiated at Sarah's request, the Torah tells us that Hagar became less respectful of her mistress, and Sarah, blaming Abraham for the whole situation, treats Hagar very harshly, leading to Hagar running away. In that instance, God persuades Hagar to go back. Then, in the story we read today, after Isaac comes along, Sarah sees Abraham's two sons playing together and declares that Ishmael must not receive any inheritance and demands that he and his mother be expelled, which, after some anguish, Abraham complies with. Now, many have attributed sinister motives to Ishmael's playing, but on the surface of it, it seems Sarah's primary concern is that her own son will receive the full inheritance, and she is willing to condemn two people to exile, if not death, for that is what nearly happens in the wilderness, in order to get her way. Her treatment of Hagar in this story and the prior one certainly does not reflect well upon her. We can look similarly at our other biblical leaders, even Moses. Certainly he is an immensely important figure in Judaism. But let's remember that he was resistant to being God's messenger to Pharaoh, was often quick to anger at the Israelites' rebelliousness, and disobeyed God's instructions in anger in the matter where he was asked to request water from a rock, provoking God's ire to the point where he was not permitted to experience the culmination of his life's work. Even Miriam, though she is a prophetess and leader in the few passages she appears in, is exiled from the camp and given a skin disease because she initiates gossip about Moses' Cushite wife, possibly with racist overtones given that Cush was the name for modern Ethiopia. And King David, who is usually considered our greatest king, was guilty of all sorts of terrible things, the least of which was sleeping with one of his general's wives while he was at war. And upon finding that she was pregnant, trying to cover it up by bringing that general home to his wife, so it would appear he was the father and not David. And when that failed, he sent that general to the front line to die, murder, so that he could marry her. And yet, we are still able to recognize David's achievements as king And the Messiah that Jews over the centuries have prayed for to herald in an age of universal peace is intended to be a descendant of the line of Davidic kings. In fact, you would be hard-pressed to find any major biblical character in our holy texts without any moral flaws, because humans are inherently flawed. Indeed, that is why we have these high holidays. No one can stand up to absolute scrutiny, and we have to accept that people who do important things in their lives were flawed humans, and often acted in morally questionable ways or believed offensive things. Yet, we still recognize the good they did and the important role they played in history. What about changing communal values? Some argue that the historical figures who have monuments may have expressed views that in their time would have been normal, but in our time we see them to be highly immoral, and we should not fault them for the thinking of the time. After all, can we expect all important historical figures to be so forward-thinking as to transcend the accepted views of their own times? Even in Judaism, we have to face this question when looking at certain passages in the Torah. Passages that implicitly permit slavery, require animal sacrifices, subject women to adultery tests, punish a rapist by having him marry his victim without possibility of divorce, allow soldiers to force captive women to be their wives, and many more cases that are offensive to our current values. And in many cases, they were offensive to the values of our predecessors in the Talmudic era or the Middle Ages, who effectively legislated these things out of existence. Often the reason being that in the time that the Torah was given, some of these things were so ingrained into society that had God commanded a more moral stance, no one would have followed them. But by commanding laws that were a significant improvement over the behaviors of the surrounding peoples in these areas, incremental moral improvements were made, to be improved upon over time as society became more open to them. In other words, Judaism does recognize changing standards of morality. This is possibly best illustrated by a midrashic discussion of Noah. The Torah tells us that he was righteous, blameless in his generation. But what does that actually mean? The Midrash says it could mean that compared to all the others in his generation, who were totally morally bankrupt, he was marginally better than the rest. Or it could mean that he maintained the highest levels of morality by an absolute standard, despite the fact that he lived in a generation that had low morals. Our tradition recognizes both possibilities, and either way, we regard Noah as a prominent biblical figure, mentioned in our Rosh Hashanah Musaf service as one of the figures that we ask God to remember his covenant with. This is and should be an ongoing dialogue, according to Judaism, about how we should judge people's character, whether relative to their generation standards or absolute standards. Neither is deemed to be the correct view, but we understand there is to be value just in that discussion. Nevertheless, Judaism teaches that the good that people do must be remembered, even if they also do things that are morally dubious. That is why we still regard Sarah and Abraham, Miriam and Moses, and even David as important Jewish figures with some qualities that we should aspire to, and some that we should not. There's a very minor character in the Megillah named Harbona, who is key to the execution of Haman, and the Torah tells us we must remember his name for good, not because he was some pinnacle of morality. We barely know a thing about him. He might have been acting out of his own interests and motivations, but in the end, he did a good thing that saved our people, and therefore we are required to remember him for good, whatever his character. So what should our position be on the removal of monuments? I found inspiration in an unlikely part of the Talmud. I was reading about subjects that are forbidden to be taught, and one of those is about the meaning of Ezekiel's vision of God on a chariot with his heavenly host that we read on Shavuot. I found a very interesting and relevant statement in there, but unfortunately, since it's forbidden to teach about that subject, I can't tell you what it is. No, I actually can, because it's really just a discussion of an inconsistency in the book of Ezekiel. In that first vision, he sees angels accompanying God that have 4 faces: a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. But later on in the book, Ezekiel sees these angels again, and even says these are the same angels he saw the first time. But when he describes them, he describes one of the 4 faces differently. Instead of saying there's a face of an ox, he says there's a face of a cherub, whatever that is. The Talmud explains this inconsistency by telling us that originally the fourth face was an ox, but upon seeing it, Ezekiel pleaded with God to change it, because an ox would be a constant reminder to Israel of their great sin of the golden calf. So God agreed, and he changed the face of the angels to something else. In other words, if having a public symbol is upsetting to a group of people, it behooves us to remove that symbol. And interestingly, this would not just apply to the party that was harmed, but even more so to the party that had done the harm, as it would be a reminder to them that they had done something wrong. In short, as Hillel famously said on one foot, "What is hurtful to you, do not do to your neighbor." If we are uncomfortable with a monument to an anti-Semite who expelled the Jews from his country, burnt our sacred texts, and was responsible for much Jewish loss of life, and perhaps even more uncomfortable at the statements that people should remember his good qualities and he should be a model for the people of St. Louis, then we also need to recognize that other monuments can be offensive to people despite the positive qualities or the historical significance of the figures depicted. As Jews, we have no great love of statues in any case. So in my evaluation, it seems to me that we should support efforts to remove monuments and statues that represent offensive values, whether offensive to us or to others, or both, from the public domain, while still maintaining ongoing dialogue about both the positive and the negative qualities of those historical figures, as we do with our biblical figures. One thing we certainly believe in as Jews is that hearing different points of view enhances our understanding, even if we have to agree to disagree. This may be a challenge in the current political climate where rational discussion is too often replaced with an us or them mentality. But hopefully we can overcome that and come to some consensus on the statue issue, even if it may be a monumental task. Shana Tova.